The sound came before the scream, glass against marble. A medicine bottle exploding into 100 pieces against the wall of the east wing, pills scattering like buckshot across the polished floor of the DeLuca mansion. Then the scream, "Get out! Get out of my room!" A man in blue scrubs burst through the double doors of the bedroom, one hand pressed to his forehead, blood leaking between his fingers. He didn't stop running until he hit the staircase, and even then he looked back at the door like it might follow him. The hallway froze. Two housekeepers standing near the linen closet stared at the floor. A private physician, clipboard still in hand, took 2 steps backward without seeming to notice he was doing it. Down at the end of the corridor, a man in a dark suit with a coiled earpiece kept his eyes fixed on a painting of Lake Michigan, as if studying brushstrokes was more important than the 68-year-old man currently destroying his bedroom. Nobody in that hallway would have hesitated to walk into a room full of armed men, but nobody wanted to walk into that one. Luca DeLuca stood a few feet from the door, hands in his pockets, jaw tight, watching the bleeding caregiver disappear down the staircase. He was 35 years old, and men 3 times his age lowered their voices when he entered a room. Judges took his calls after hours. Union bosses rearranged their schedules for him. There was a version of Chicago that existed only because Luca DeLuca allowed it to. And yet here he was, in his own house, unable to make his feet cross 15 feet of hallway. Rafe Conti appeared beside him, silent as always, reading the scene with the same flat calm he brought to every crisis. He glanced at the shattered bottle, the blood on the marble, the closed door. 21, Rafe said quietly. Luca exhaled through his nose. He lasted 40 minutes. That's practically a personal best. It wasn't a joke. Not really. It was the only way Luca had learned to survive standing outside that door. 21 caregivers. 21 resignations, most of them within the first week. Nurses with decades of experience. Specialists flown in from Boston and Miami. A former Army medic who'd survived 2 deployments and lasted 6 days. All of them had walked into Vittorio DeLuca's room, believing they could manage him. All of them had walked out defeated, and some of them bleeding. 3 years ago, Vittorio DeLuca had been one of the most respected men in Chicago. Feared in some circles, revered in others, a man whose word ended arguments before they started. Then a stroke had taken the left side of his body, and it seemed, most of his willingness to speak. Since that day, he had not said more than a handful of words to another living person. He had become a locked door in the shape of a man, and Luca, who could break down almost any door in the city, had no idea how to open this one. "We need someone new by Monday," Rafe said. "The board's going to ask why the family patriarch has gone through more caregivers than Reeves has excuses." "Find someone," Luca said, already turning away from the door. "I don't care what it costs." He didn't know yet that the person who would finally change everything wasn't going to cost him anything at all. She was going to walk in, wearing a worn canvas bag over one shoulder, flat shoes built for standing 12-hour shifts, and absolutely no fear of his name. Sofia Bellini arrived on a Tuesday morning, and the first thing anyone noticed about her was that she didn't look like she belonged. The DeLuca estate in Lake Forest sat on 11 private acres overlooking Lake Michigan. Its Italianate stonework and iron gates, built to remind visitors that this family did not answer to ordinary rules. The specialists who usually came through those gates arrived in luxury sedans, dressed like they were interviewing for a magazine cover. Sophia arrived in a 12-year-old hatchback with a dented bumper. She wore navy scrubs that had clearly been washed 1,000 times, her dark curls pulled back in a low knot, and she carried her own medical bag, not the kind hospitals issued, but a soft leather one with a frayed strap, clearly older than her nursing license. She was 30 years old, warm-eyed, unhurried in the way people are, when they've learned that panic never actually helps anyone heal faster. She didn't glance up at the mansion with the awe most people gave it. She looked at it the way she'd look at any house with a sick person inside, like a job, not a spectacle. Luca met her in the foyer with his arms crossed and skepticism written across every line of his face. "You've read the file," he said, without introducing himself first. "I have," Sophia said. 21 caregivers. Refuses medication most days. Refuses food half the time. Hasn't spoken a full sentence in 3 years. She studied Luca for a beat. "You didn't put in the file that he throws things." "I didn't think I needed to. It's fairly self-explanatory by caregiver 19. "Did they leave because he asked them to?" Sophia asked. Luca blinked, thrown by the question. He threw a bottle at the last one's head. "That wasn't my question." Something in Luca's chest shifted, just slightly. The particular irritation of being outmaneuvered by someone half his size and none of his power. He wasn't used to people redirecting him. He usually redirected everyone else. "You have 4 hours before I decide this was a mistake," he said. "I don't need 4 hours," Sophia said, already walking past him toward the staircase. "I need about 10 minutes and a little bit of quiet." Rafe, standing near the door with his arms folded, watched her go and then looked at Luca with an expression Luca did not appreciate. "What?" Luca said flatly. Nothing," Rafe said. "I just haven't seen anyone talk to you like that since your mother." Luca didn't answer. He followed Sophia up the stairs instead, close enough to intervene if she needed him, far enough to prove, mostly to himself, that he wasn't worried. He was worried. He just wasn't going to admit it yet. Before Sophia reached Vittorio's door, she stopped in the hallway lined with family photographs. There was Vittorio in his 40s, dark-haired and broad-shouldered, laughing at something outside the frame. Isabella beside him in half of the photos, her hand always somewhere on his arm or his shoulder, like she'd never once doubted she belonged there. A wedding photo. A photo of a much younger Luca sitting on his father's knee, gap-toothed and grinning, looking nothing like the man currently standing 3 feet behind Sophia with his jaw set like stone. On a side table beneath the photographs sat a small collection of old cards, yellowed with age, stacked and forgotten. Sophia's eyes moved over them without touching anything at first. "You don't need to look through those," Luca said, an edge creeping into his voice. "I'm not going through your family's things," Sophia said calmly. "I'm trying to understand the man I'm about to walk in on. Photographs tell you things medical charts don't." She lifted the top card gently, an anniversary card, the paper soft with age, and opened it without asking permission, which made Luca's jaw tighten again. Inside, in looping handwriting that had clearly been written by a woman deeply in love, were the words, "To my amor, 22 years, and I'd choose you again in every single one." Sophia's eyes lingered there a moment longer than they needed to. She set the card back exactly where it had been. "He still wears his ring," she said. It wasn't a question. "Every day for 3 years," Luca said, "even during physical therapy, even when it makes his hand swell." Sophia nodded slowly, filing that fact away somewhere behind her calm brown eyes. "Give me 10 minutes alone," she said. "No guards outside the door, no doctor hovering. Just me." "Absolutely not," Luca said immediately. "You saw what he did to the last one. I saw what he did when 6 people were talking at him at once, and someone tried to force a pill into his hand before he'd even had breakfast, Sophia said. That's not the same thing as violence, Mr. DeLuca. That's someone drowning and swinging at whoever's closest. Luca stared at her. Nobody spoke to him with that kind of steady, unhurried confidence. Not judges, not rivals, not men who carried guns for a living, and yet there was nothing disrespectful in her tone. She simply wasn't afraid of him, and that, more than anything, was what kept him quiet. 10 minutes, he said finally. I'll be right outside. I know you will, Sophia said, already turning toward the door. That's not a problem. Just don't come in unless I ask you to. She stepped inside and closed the door softly behind her. The room was dim, curtains drawn against the morning light, the air thick with the particular stillness of a person who had spent 3 years trying to disappear inside 4 walls. Vittorio De Luca sat in a wheelchair near the window, his once broad shoulders curved inward, his left hand curled uselessly in his lap. His eyes, dark, sharp, exactly like his son's, snapped toward the door the instant it opened. Out, he barked, the word thick and slightly slurred from the stroke's lingering damage, but unmistakable. His right hand reached for the water glass on the side table, ready to throw it. Sophia didn't move toward him. She didn't reach for the glass, didn't try to soothe him with the practiced calm nurses were trained to perform. She simply lowered herself down onto the floor, several feet away from his chair, and sat. Vittorio stared at her, glass still raised, clearly confused by the absence of the fight he'd been braced for. I'm not going to make you take anything, Sophia said quietly. I'm not going to make you eat or talk or do exercises today. I'm just going to sit here for a few minutes, if that's all right with you. He didn't lower the glass, but he didn't throw it either. Sophia let the silence stretch. She looked, unhurried, around the room, at the framed photograph on the nightstand of a woman with warm eyes and dark hair threaded with silver, at the small wooden box beside it that no one had opened in years judging by the dust, at the wedding ring on Vittorio's trembling hand. Minutes passed. The glass slowly lowered to his lap. Sophia's gaze settled on the ring. Amor, she said softly. It wasn't a question. It wasn't performance. It was simply a word, spoken the way you'd speak to someone you already understood. Vittorio's whole body went rigid. That's what she called you, Sophia said gently, nodding toward the photograph. Wasn't it? Vittorio's mouth opened. Nothing came out at first. Just a broken, strangled sound. 3 years of silence, trying to force itself through a throat that had forgotten how to carry more than fury. His good hand came up to his chest, pressing hard, like he was trying to hold something in that had been trying to escape for a very long time. Sophia didn't move closer. She didn't finish his sentence for him. She simply waited, her eyes steady and unafraid, giving him the one thing no doctor, no caregiver, no well-meaning specialist had thought to give him in 3 years. Room to feel it. Vittorio De Luca broke. It started as a shudder and became something closer to a collapse. His shoulders curling forward, his good hand pressing over his eyes, sobs tearing out of him in ragged, 3 years overdue waves. Sophia stayed exactly where she was, close enough that he wasn't alone, far enough that he wasn't cornered. Outside the door, Luca De Luca, a man who had once stood completely still while a rival held a gun to his chest, felt his own knees threaten to give out. He hadn't heard his father cry since the day they buried his mother. He didn't go in. He stood with his back against the wall beside the door, his hand pressed flat against the cold marble, listening to 3 years of silence finally break apart on the other side of a door he hadn't been brave enough to open himself. Rafe found him there 20 minutes later, still standing in the same spot. "He's crying," Luca said before Rafe could ask. Rafe's usual dry composure faltered, just slightly. "Since when does that word make grown men cry?" "I don't know," Luca admitted. It was the first time in years he'd said those 3 words out loud about anything. "But I want to know how the hell she knew to say it. Asterisk, if a single word could crack open 3 years of silence, imagine what the truth buried underneath it could do to this family." Asterisk, Sofia stayed through the entire night. She didn't push Vittorio to speak in full sentences. She didn't lecture him about medication schedules or physical therapy goals. She simply sat with him, offered him water when he seemed thirsty, and let silence exist without trying to fill it with cheerful noise the way every previous caregiver had. Slowly, in pieces, words came. "Lake," Vittorio said at one point, looking toward the window. "You like the lake," Sofia said. "Do you want the curtains open?" He nodded. "Later, lemons." His voice cracked on the word, like it cost him something to say it. "Tell me about the lemons," Sofia said gently. He didn't. Not that night. But he didn't throw anything either. And by morning, when Luca came to check on the room, he'd been too afraid to enter himself. He found his father asleep in his wheelchair by the window, and Sofia sitting quietly nearby with a notebook in her lap, writing something down. "What did you do?" Luca asked, his voice lower than usual, almost hesitant. Sofia looked up. "I stopped trying to fix him. I hired you to fix him." "No," Sofia said, closing her notebook. "You hired me to help him live. Those aren't the same job." Mr. DeLuca, and I think somewhere along the way, everyone in this house forgot that. Luca didn't have a response for that. He stood in the doorway a moment longer, watching his father sleep peacefully, for what looked like the first time in years, and then he walked away before Sofia could see how much her words had rattled him. 2 days later, Sofia made a decision that nearly got her fired. She wheeled Vittorio through the east wing, past the chapel, and stopped in front of a set of glass doors that hadn't been opened in 3 years. Behind them sat a conservatory, Isabella's conservatory, filled with the dust-covered remains of lemon trees she'd once tended with her own hands. The staff physician, trailing behind them, immediately objected. "This room hasn't been climate-controlled properly. The exposure alone could." "Could what?" Sofia said, not unkindly, remind him of something real. She pushed the doors open anyway. Luca arrived minutes later, alerted by a nervous housekeeper, and found Sofia helping his father toward one of the surviving lemon trees while dust motes floated gold in the afternoon light. "What is this?" Luca's voice was sharp, controlled the way it got right before he made someone very unhappy. "This room has been closed since my mother died. He hasn't been in here in 3 years for a reason." "I know," Sofia said, not backing down. "That's the problem. You don't get to decide that. You've spent 3 years making every decision for him," Sofia said, turning to face Luca fully. "Because you're terrified he'll make the wrong one, or that he'll fall apart if you give him the choice. He's my father." "Exactly," Sofia said. "Not your prisoner." The words landed like a slap, and Luca actually took a half step back, something flickering behind his eyes that looked almost like recognition. He opened his mouth to argue further, and then Vittorio, standing shakily with one hand braced on Sofia's arm, reached out and touched a lemon hanging low on the branch. He brought it close to his face, breathed in, his eyes filled. "Isabella," he said, voice trembling. "Hated winter." A pause, then slower, like he was pulling the words up from somewhere very deep. "Grew lemons, so she'd always have. Summer." Luca let out a sound that was half a laugh, half something closer to grief, a sound Sofia hadn't heard from him before and wouldn't hear often. Vittorio, hearing his son's laugh, turned toward him and smiled. It was the first time in 3 years anyone in that house had seen Vittorio De Luca smile. Luca looked at Sofia across the conservatory, dust and gold light hanging between them, and something in the way he studied her face was different from the wariness he'd carried since the moment she'd walked through his front door. But what Luca didn't know yet was that his father's smile wasn't the only thing hidden in this room. While Vittorio rested beneath the largest lemon tree, Sofia noticed a floor tile near the base of the planter that sat slightly higher than the others. She crouched, pressed her palm against it, and felt it shift. Beneath it, a small tin box, corners rusted, clearly hidden by someone who hadn't wanted it found by accident. She didn't open it. Luca, watching from a few feet away, frowned. "What is that?" "I don't know," Sofia said, setting the tile carefully back into place without lifting the lid. "And I'm not going to find out without your permission. It's not mine to open. You found a hidden box in my mother's conservatory and you're not curious?" "Curiosity isn't consent," Sofia said simply. Luca stared at her for a long moment. He'd spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who took whatever they could reach. The second no one was looking. Men who'd steal a business, a secret, a life if it served them. He wasn't used to someone leaving something valuable untouched, simply because it wasn't theirs. He said nothing else about it that day. But that night, for the first time since his mother's funeral, Luca De Luca found himself thinking about a woman who wasn't his enemy, his rival, or his responsibility, and not being entirely sure what to do with that fact. A week later, Vittorio pressed something small and cold into Sofia's palm during a quiet afternoon. A brass key, old, tarnished with age. "Isabella," he managed, his hand trembling around hers. "Letters. Before." His face crumpled, the sentence collapsing before he could finish it, his eyes filling with something that looked less like grief and more like guilt. Sofia closed her hand gently around the key. "You don't have to finish that today." He shook his head, frustrated with himself, tears slipping down weathered cheeks. "Before, I believed. The wrong man." Sofia didn't press. She simply held his hand until his breathing slowed, filing away every fragment of the sentence for a day when he was ready to say the rest of it. But she couldn't stop turning it over in her mind. "Before I believed the wrong man." What man? Believed him about what? Somewhere in this house, a truth had been buried alongside Isabella De Luca, and Sofia was starting to suspect it hadn't stayed buried by accident. The medication room was Sofia's next stop, purely out of professional habit. She liked to know exactly what a patient was being given, when, and by whom. Details most caregivers glossed over in favor of simply administering whatever the chart said. What she found didn't add up. Dosage records for Vittorio's anti-anxiety medication showed regular administration, but the actual pill count in the cabinet was higher than it should have been if he'd truly been taking them daily. Sedative prescriptions appeared on the chart that Sofia had never personally administered and had no record of anyone else giving him either. Injection logs from the early months after his stroke were incomplete, missing dates, missing signatures. It didn't look like negligence. It looked deliberate, a pattern designed to keep a man lethargic, foggy, and too exhausted to fight back against anything, including his own recovery. The medication bottle in her hand should have been nearly empty. It wasn't. Someone had been refilling it without documentation, which meant someone had been in this room recently and it hadn't been her. Sophia closed the cabinet slowly, her pulse picking up. Someone had entered this room before her, and whoever it was clearly didn't want Vittorio De Luca to ever fully wake up. That evening, Sophia sought out Sister Teresa, an elderly retired nun who'd once cared for Isabella during her final illness, and now lived quietly in a small cottage near the parish the De Lucas had funded for decades. Sophia had found her name scrawled in the margin of one of the old cards in the hallway. Sister Teresa welcomed her with tea, and the particular gentleness of someone who had spent a lifetime sitting with the dying. Isabella was frightened. Near the end, the old nun said, her hands wrapped around her cup. Not of dying. She'd made peace with that. She was frightened that no one believed her. Believed her about what? Sophia asked. She told me quietly, because she didn't want to worry Vittorio, that she'd found something wrong in the family's business records. Money moving somewhere it shouldn't have gone. She tried to warn him. Sister Teresa's eyes grew distant. But by then, the doctors had convinced Vittorio that her cancer medication was making her paranoid, confused, seeing conspiracies that weren't there. Sophia's stomach tightened, and Vittorio believed them instead of her. He was a frightened husband watching his wife slip away, Sister Teresa said, not unkindly, but with sorrow. He wanted so badly for her fears to be nothing but sickness talking. It was easier than believing someone he trusted was stealing from his own family while his wife was dying. Isabella died believing her own husband didn't trust her, Sophia said quietly. Sister Teresa nodded, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. And Vittorio has spent every day since trying to live with that. Sophia thought of the tin box hidden beneath the conservatory floor, of the brass key pressed into her palm, of before I believed the wrong man, not just a man he'd doubted. Men he had trusted, the same men perhaps, still standing in his house today. The guilt that had kept Vittorio De Luca silent for 3 years wasn't only about his stroke. It was about a debt he believed he could never repay to a wife who had died feeling unheard. And Sophia was the first person in that house who'd ask the right questions to find out why. Luca began attending Vittorio's rehabilitation sessions, always with a reasonable excuse ready, a business call he needed to take nearby. Paperwork he could just as easily review in the therapy room as his office. Sophia never called him on it directly. She didn't need to. She noticed how he watched. Not his father, not exclusively. He watched her. The way she offered Vittorio 2 choices instead of commands, letting him choose which exercise came first, which chair he wanted, small decisions that added up to a man slowly remembering he still had a will of his own. The way she never spoke to the household staff any differently than she spoke to Luca. The same warmth, the same directness, no performance for anyone's benefit. The way she quietly stepped out of the room whenever a private moment passed between father and son, giving them space without being asked. During one session, helping Vittorio transfer from his wheelchair to a therapy mat, Sophia's foot caught the edge of a resistance band left on the floor. She stumbled, and Luca, who'd been standing closer than strictly necessary, caught her before she hit the ground, one arm wrapped firmly around her waist. For a moment, neither of them moved. "You can let go," Sophia said, breathless, very aware of how close his hand was against her ribs. "I know," Luca said. He didn't let go. Not immediately. A full beat too long passed before his arm finally dropped away, and when it did, something unspoken hung in the space between them. Something neither of them was ready to name yet. Later that same evening, Sophia found Luca in his study, still in the suit he'd worn since morning. A glass of untouched whiskey sitting beside a stack of papers he clearly hadn't read in the last hour. "When was the last time you slept?" she asked from the doorway. "I sleep," Luca said, not looking up. "You close your eyes for a few hours and call it the same thing," Sophia said. "It isn't." Luca finally looked up at her, something unguarded flickering across his face for just a moment before the control slid back into place. No one had asked him that question in years, not his consigliere, not his father, not the dozens of people whose lives depended on his decisions every single day. Everyone assumed a man like Luca De Luca didn't need to be asked if he was okay. Sophia Bellini apparently hadn't gotten that memo. "I'm fine," Luca said. "I didn't ask if you were fine," Sophia said gently. "I asked if you were sleeping." She left before he could answer, and Luca sat alone in his study for a long time afterward, staring at nothing, wondering when exactly it had started mattering to him, whether one particular nurse noticed things about him that no one else bothered to see. 3 days later, everything changed. Sophia had gone back to the medication room late in the evening to recheck the discrepancies she'd flagged, wanting to compile a clear record before bringing her concerns to Luca directly. She was halfway through cross-referencing dates when she heard a sound in the hallway. Soft, deliberate footsteps that stopped the moment she stepped toward the door. She followed anyway. A shadowed figure moved quickly down the servants' staircase at the end of the east wing, and Sophia, moving on instinct more than caution, followed, calling out, "Excuse me, who's there?" A hand shoved her hard from behind. She hit the stairs at an angle, her wrist twisting beneath her as she tumbled down 4 steps before catching herself against the railing, pain lancing white-hot up her arm. By the time she managed to sit up, breathless and shaking, whoever had pushed her was gone. Luca found her less than 2 minutes later, alerted by a housekeeper who'd heard the fall. He came around the corner at a speed no one in that house had ever seen him move, and for the first time since Sophia had arrived, the careful, controlled mask he wore every day of his life cracked completely open. "Lock down the property," he snapped at the 2 guards flanking the staircase, his voice low but absolutely lethal. "No one leaves, no one. I want every exit covered in the next 90 seconds. Then he knelt beside Sophia, and his hands, the same hands that could sign a man's death warrant without a tremor, were shaking as he reached for her. "Tell me where it hurts," he said, and his voice had lost every trace of the command it usually carried. It was raw, almost desperate. "My wrist," Sophia managed. "I think it's just sprained, Don't move it." He was already lifting her. Careful, deliberate, cradling her, like something that might shatter if he wasn't gentle enough. "I've got you." Sophia looked up at his face as he carried her toward the nearest sitting room. And what she saw there wasn't the cold, controlled man who'd greeted her at the front door 2 weeks ago. It was fear, real, unguarded fear, not for the conspiracy that was clearly unraveling somewhere in his own house. For her, asterisk. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Luca De Luca wasn't afraid of losing control of his empire. He was afraid of losing her. Asterisk. Rafe launched a full investigation before the night was over, and what he found over the following days made Luca's blood run cold in a way violence never had. Gabriel Vescari, the family's attorney and financial trustee for over 2 decades, the man who'd taught Luca how to tie a tie for his mother's funeral, had been quietly siphoning money out of the De Luca family's legitimate business holdings for nearly 15 years. Shell corporations in 3 states. Real estate transactions with numbers that didn't reconcile. Wire transfers routed through accounts that led back, eventually, to Gabriel's own private holdings. roughly $126 million, missing. And Dr. Malcolm Reeves, Vittorio's respected neurologist, the man responsible for monitoring his stroke recovery for 3 years, had been receiving payments from an account traced back to Gabriel's network. Payments that lined up almost perfectly, with periods of unexplained medication changes in Vittorio's chart. He was never trying to kill him, Rafe said grimly, spreading the documents across Luca's desk. He just needed him quiet, confused, too foggy to notice what was happening to the businesses he still legally controlled on paper. Every caregiver who lasted more than a few weeks got reassigned or quietly let go before they could notice the pattern. "Except her," Luca said. "Except her," Rafe agreed. "She's the first person who actually paid attention to your father instead of just managing his symptoms. That makes her a problem for whoever's been running this." Luca stared at the numbers on the page, at 15 years of a man he'd trusted since childhood systematically stealing from his own family, while his mother lay dying and his father drowned in silence. "Gabriel knew my mother suspected something," Luca said slowly, the pieces settling into place with sickening clarity. "That's why she was so afraid at the end. That's why my father won't talk. He's not just grieving her. He's ashamed he didn't believe her." Asterisk. Someone in this family had been protected for 15 years by the very silence they'd engineered. And Sofia Bellini, without meaning to, had become the first person capable of ending it. Asterisk. Sofia understood the danger the moment her wrist was properly wrapped, and the adrenaline had worn off enough to let her think clearly. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was a witness, a threat, a loose thread someone had already tried once to cut. That night she packed her bag. She found Luca in the hallway outside his father's room, and something in her face must have told him exactly what she was about to say before she said it. "I think I need to go," Sofia said. "If I'm putting your father in more danger by being here." "Don't," Luca said, cutting her off, his voice tight. "Luca, if you want to leave," he said, "I will put 12 men around your apartment and never contact you again. I will make sure nothing and no one touches you for the rest of your life, and you will never have to see me again if that's what you want." Sofia blinked. "That sounds insane." "That's the reasonable version," Luca said, and for one brief moment, something almost like humor flickered across his exhausted face. Then it vanished, replaced by something far more serious. "Don't leave because you think you're the danger, Sofia. You didn't create this. The rot was already inside these walls long before you walked through the front door. You just made it visible enough that someone got scared." Sofia set her bag down slowly. "My mother spent the last months of her life," Luca said, quieter now, "believing no one in this family trusted her. My father has spent 3 years punishing himself for it. 21 people walked into that room and saw a broken man they were being paid to manage. You saw someone worth saving." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped even lower. "I don't know how to ask you to stay without it sounding like an order. I'm not good at asking for things. I'm only good at requiring them." "Then don't require it," Sofia said softly. "Ask." Luca held her gaze for a long moment. "Please stay," he said. "Not for my father. For whatever this is between us that I don't have a name for yet." Sofia picked her bag back up and set it down on the chair beside the door instead of by her feet, which was as close to an answer as either of them needed in that moment. She stayed for Vittorio. She stayed because the truth mattered, and someone needed to make sure it saw daylight. But some small, honest part of her admitted, lying awake that night, that she also stayed because of the way Luca De Luca's hands had trembled when he thought she was hurt. The annual De Luca Council meeting had been held every year for 3 decades, a gathering of nearly 40 senior family captains, associates, and advisors in the mansion's private council chamber. Dark wood, high windows, a long table that had witnessed more decisions about Chicago's underworld than any courtroom in the state. This year, Gabriel Vescari believed it would proceed exactly as it always had. Vittorio, incapacitated and silent, would remain upstairs. Luca would preside. Business would continue as it always did, quietly, profitably, with Gabriel's hand still firmly on the levers no one thought to check. Dr. Reeves sat near the back of the room, visibly uneasy, adjusting his collar every few minutes like it had grown too tight. Luca knew everything. He'd known for 4 days. He'd said nothing to either man, letting them believe their secret still held, because he wanted the entire family, every captain, every advisor, every man who'd have to decide where his loyalty belonged in the aftermath, to witness the truth unfold together. At exactly the scheduled hour, the council chamber's heavy doors opened. Vittorio De Luca walked through them, not in a wheelchair. Slowly, leaning on a cane, one hand curled tight around the handle, his steps careful but his spine straight in a way no one in that room had seen in 3 years. Sophia walked beside him. She didn't hold his arm. She simply stayed close enough that if his balance faltered, she'd be there. But she let him walk into that room on his own 2 feet, exactly as he needed to. Every man in the chamber rose to his feet without being asked. Some of the oldest captains, men who'd served Vittorio for 30 years, had tears in their eyes as he made his way to the head of the table. One veteran, a man named Salvatore, who'd fought beside Vittorio in disputes that had shaped half the city, pressed a fist to his own chest as Vittorio passed him. Vittorio reached the front of the room. A chair had been prepared for him. He refused it. He stood, both hands now braced on his cane, and looked out at the room full of men who had once feared and respected him in equal measure. "My family," he said. His voice was slow, effortful, each word costing him visible strength, but every syllable landed with absolute clarity. The room went utterly silent. "I was silent," Vittorio continued, "because I was ashamed." He let that sit. No one moved. "Ashamed I did not believe my wife," he said. "Ashamed I let a stroke take my voice when the truth is, I stopped using it long before that. The day I chose to believe the wrong man over her." He reached into the pocket of his jacket with his good hand and produced a small tin box, the same box Sophia had found beneath the conservatory floor. Its rusted lid now opened, a stack of letters inside tied together with faded ribbon. He held it out. Luca stepped forward and took it from his father's trembling hand. "Read them," Vittorio said. "All of you. Asterisk." And in the space of a single silent chamber, 30 years of unquestioned loyalty was about to collapse under the weight of the truth. Isabella De Luca had died trying to tell someone. Asterisk. Luca opened the first letter, and Isabella's handwriting, the same looping script Sophia had noticed weeks earlier in that old anniversary card, filled the page with dates, figures, and names. Transactions she'd noticed while reviewing the family's charitable foundation records. Discrepancies between what came into certain accounts and what should have. A name circled twice. Gabriel. Rafe stepped forward with a leather folder of his own, laying forensic accounting records across the long table for every captain in the room to see. 15 years of shell corporations, wire transfers, $126 million, meticulously traced. And beside those records, a separate set of documents. Payments from an account connected to Gabriel's network, deposited quarterly into an account belonging to Dr. Malcolm Reeves. Every eye in the room turned toward the back of the chamber, where Reeves sat frozen, his face draining of color. "Doctor," Lucas said quietly, "would you like to explain to this room why you were paid $400,000 in the same month you adjusted my father's medication without documenting a single reason for the change?" Reeves opened his mouth. Nothing came out at first, the same kind of silence that had gripped Vittorio 3 years earlier, except this silence had nothing noble buried beneath it. "I never meant to hurt him," Reeves finally said, his voice cracking. "I was told I was only supposed to keep him manageable, calm. I didn't think. You didn't think a man deserved to recover from a stroke because it was more convenient for someone if he stayed confused," Luca said, and the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. "You stole 3 years from my father. 3 years he could have spent healing, talking to his son, living." Reeves said nothing else. He didn't need to. His confession had already done the damage. Every eye in the chamber shifted next to Gabriel Vescari. Gabriel remained remarkably composed, considering the walls closing in around him. He rose slowly from his chair, straightening his jacket, with the same calm precision he'd used for 2 decades to smooth over every crisis the De Luca family had ever faced. "I built the legitimate side of this empire," Gabriel said, his voice smooth, almost reasonable. "Every hospital wing, every foundation, every clean dollar this family has ever put its name on, that was me. While Vittorio and Luca handled the other business, I made sure this family had a future that didn't end in a courtroom." "You stole from my mother while she was dying," Luca said. His voice had gone very quiet, and every man at that table who'd known Luca for longer than a year recognized that particular quiet as far more dangerous than shouting. Gabriel's composure flickered, just barely. "Your mother," he said, "should have worried about her cancer instead of digging through ledgers she didn't fully understand." Luca crossed the room before anyone could stop him. He had Gabriel by the collar and slammed against the wood-paneled wall before Rafe could even move. His forearm pressed hard across the older man's throat, his face inches from Gabriel's, every muscle in his body coiled with 15 years of grief and rage finally finding a place to land. "Say that again," Luca said, low and lethal. "Say it again and see what happens." Gabriel's face had gone pale, his hands scrabbling uselessly at Luca's arm, and for one long suspended moment, it looked like the council chamber was about to witness something no amount of forensic evidence would be needed to explain. Then, from the head of the table, a single word cut through the silence. "Luca." It was Vittorio's voice, not shouted, not commanding. Just his son's name, spoken with the same quiet weight Sofia had once used to reach through 3 years of silence. Luca froze. Slowly, his grip loosened. He stepped back from Gabriel, breathing hard, and turned to look at his father, who was watching him not with fear, but with something closer to recognition, the way a man looks at his own reflection in a mirror 30 years younger. Vittorio made his way slowly toward Gabriel, leaning on his cane, until he stood directly in front of the man who'd once helped carry his wife's casket. "You took my wife's truth from me," Vittorio said. Every word cost him effort, but none of them wavered. "You took 3 years from my son." A pause. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. "But you failed," Vittorio said, "to take my voice." He held Gabriel's gaze for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the head of the table. One by one, the captains in that room began to step away from Gabriel, not because anyone ordered them to, not because Luca gave a signal. They simply moved, the way a body moves away from something rotten, until Gabriel Vescari stood entirely alone in the middle of the chamber, surrounded by empty space that no amount of stolen money could ever buy back. No one needed to say another word. His silence, once his greatest weapon, had finally become his sentence. Asterisk. The most powerful thing in that room wasn't a threat, or a weapon, or even the truth itself. It was 40 men choosing, without hesitation, exactly where their loyalty belonged. Asterisk. Gabriel Vescari was arrested within the week on charges of grand theft, fraud, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Charges that would eventually stretch into a federal case involving 15 years of falsified records. Dr. Malcolm Reeves surrendered his medical license before the state board could revoke it, and cooperated fully with investigators in exchange for a lighter sentence, providing testimony that closed the last remaining gaps in the case. Luca spent the following months restructuring the family's legitimate business holdings from the ground up, bringing in independent auditors, severing every connection Gabriel had quietly built over 2 decades. It was slow, unglamorous work, nothing like the swift, decisive moves he was used to making. But for the first time in years, he found himself sleeping through most nights. Vittorio, meanwhile, threw himself into something entirely new. He established a foundation for stroke rehabilitation, funding programs for families who couldn't otherwise afford the kind of care, the kind of person who had given him his life back. Sophia became deeply involved in shaping the program, drawing on everything she'd learned from 21 failed attempts before her own. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, the family gathered for lunch in the mansion's dining room, an event that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. Vittorio insisted on cooking one of Isabella's old recipes himself, refusing every offer of help from the kitchen staff, his left hand still slower than his right, but steadier every week. "Too much garlic," Sophia said, tasting the sauce over his shoulder and wrinkling her nose. "There is no such thing as too much garlic," Vittorio said, his words still occasionally slow but no longer fragile, an edge of stubborn humor creeping back into his voice for the first time in years. "There is when it makes my eyes water from across the room." Isabella never complained. Isabella, Sophia said, was clearly being polite. Vittorio laughed, a real laugh, rough with disuse but unmistakably genuine, and swatted at Sophia's hand when she reached for the wooden spoon to adjust the seasoning herself. Luca stood in the doorway, watching the two of them argue over a pot of sauce, with the easy familiarity of people who'd known each other for years instead of months. He thought about the sound of shattered glass against marble, about the blood on a caregiver's forehead, about a hallway full of people too afraid to look at a closed door. Now his father was arguing about garlic. Luca decided quietly that it was the most beautiful argument he had ever heard. Later that week, Vittorio asked Luca to join him in the conservatory. Restored now, sunlight pouring through freshly cleaned glass onto lemon trees that had finally been given the care they deserved. "I spent 3 years believing I failed her," Vittorio said, standing beneath the largest tree, his hand resting against its trunk. "That I let her die, thinking her own husband didn't trust her word." "You were lied to," Luca said. "Both of you were. Gabriel and Reeves built an entire system designed to make sure neither of you could trust your own instincts." "I was lied to," Vittorio agreed. "But I still chose to believe the lie. That is mine to carry, Luca, not theirs." He was quiet for a moment, running his thumb over a low-hanging lemon. "Your mother believed in second chances more than anyone I ever knew," he said finally. "She would have forgiven me long before I ever forgave myself. Maybe that is the lesson I needed. 3 years of silence to understand. He turned to face his son fully. I am sorry, Vittorio said, for the years I made you carry this house alone. Luca felt something crack open in his chest, something he'd kept locked down since he was 32 years old and burying his mother, while his father sat silent beside the grave. He crossed the small distance between them and wrapped his arms around his father. Carefully, mindful of the weaker side, but firmly, the way he'd wanted to for 3 unbearable years and never once let himself. It was their first embrace since Isabella's funeral. Neither of them said anything else. Neither needed to. From the doorway, Sophia watched for a moment, her heart full, and then quietly slipped away without a word, leaving father and son alone, with everything they finally had permission to feel. Luca noticed her go. He always noticed now. The particular grace of a woman who understood exactly when to stay and exactly when to disappear, never needing credit for either. He found her later that evening near the boathouse, standing at the edge of the water, with her arms wrapped around herself against the cool lake wind, watching the last of the light spread gold across Lake Michigan. My father doesn't need you every day anymore, Luca said, coming to stand beside her. His mobility's improved. He's speaking in full sentences most of the time now. The foundation has 3 staff members who can manage his ongoing care. Sophia's shoulders dropped slightly, and something careful slid over her face. Okay, she said, already bracing for the rest of the sentence. I do, Luca said. Sophia turned to look at him. That's a terrible thing to say to a nurse. Luca. Then let me say it as a man, he said, instead of whatever I've been trying to be for the last 3 months. He turned fully to face her, the wind pulling at his jacket, his usual iron composure noticeably absent. I watched you first because you could reach my father when no one else could, he said. Then I respected you because you were the only person in this house who ever told me I was wrong and meant it. Somewhere after that, I started noticing that rooms felt different when you walked into them, quieter, less like something I had to survive. Sophia said nothing, letting him find his way through it. I have spent my entire life, Luca continued, making sure people are too afraid to leave me. It's easier that way. Loyalty built on fear doesn't require trusting anyone. He exhaled, and for the first time, his voice wavered slightly. With you, I'm not afraid of that. I'm afraid you'll choose to leave anyway, and there won't be a single thing I can do to stop it. Because the only thing I actually want is for you to want to stay. Sophia felt her own eyes sting. Then don't command me to stay, she said softly. I won't. Ask me. Luca held her gaze, the lake wind moving between them. 3 years of a man too controlled to ask for anything thing, finally standing at the edge of something he couldn't order into existence. Stay, he said quietly. Please. Not because my father needs you. Because I do. Sophia stepped closer, close enough that the wind no longer felt cold, and reached for his hand. Okay, she said simply. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a kiss stolen in the rain, or a declaration shouted across a crowded room. It was 2 people standing quietly by the water, choosing each other without anyone commanding either of them to. It was, somehow, exactly enough. The De Luca Foundation's first charity gala took place 6 months later in the mansion's ballroom, transformed for the evening with soft gold lighting and tables full of donors who'd come to support the stroke rehabilitation program now bearing Isabella De Luca's name. Vittorio stood at the podium to deliver the closing remarks, his cane resting against the wood beside him, his voice slow but steady in a way that filled the entire room with quiet reverence. 3 years ago, he said, I stopped speaking. I told myself it was the stroke. Some of it was, but most of it was shame and grief and a silence I built myself because I did not believe I deserved to be heard anymore. He paused, scanning the room. One woman disagreed. He beckoned toward the side of the stage, where Sophia stood in a simple green dress, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but stepping forward anyway when Vittorio's eyes found hers. They say this woman gave me my voice back, Vittorio said as Sophia joined him at the podium. The room applauded warmly. He waited for it to settle, then shook his head. No, he said. She did not give me anything I did not already have. She simply reminded me I still had something worth saying. The room went quiet, moved, several guests dabbing at their eyes. Vittorio's gaze shifted to the front table, where Luca sat watching, his usual guarded expression nowhere in sight. And apparently, Vittorio added, a hint of mischief creeping into his tired smile, she also taught my son how to smile again, something I had genuinely begun to believe was medically impossible. Warm laughter rippled through the ballroom, breaking the emotional weight of the moment with exactly the kind of lightness Isabella herself would have loved. Vittorio reached for Luca's hand as his son rose to join them on stage and placed it gently into Sophia's. He didn't need to say anything else. The applause that followed wasn't polite gala applause. It was the sound of an entire room witnessing something rebuilt from nothing. A family, a voice, a love story that had started with a single Italian word spoken softly enough to reach a broken heart. Months later, the conservatory that had once sat locked and forgotten for 3 years was full of noise again. Children from the Foundation's rehabilitation program, running between the restored lemon trees, laughing, chasing each other through dappled afternoon light. Vittorio sat on a bench beneath the largest tree, a framed photograph of Isabella resting on his lap. He touched the edge of the frame gently, the way he touched it every day now, no longer with guilt, but with something closer to gratitude. You would have loved this, he murmured to the photograph, watching the children play. You always said this room needed more life in it. Down by the water, Luca and Sophia walked slowly along the edge of Lake Michigan, the evening light spreading gold across the surface exactly as it had the night he'd asked her to stay. Their hands brushed together, once, twice, and this time neither of them pulled away. For 3 years, everyone had tried to make Vittorio De Luca speak. Sophia Bellini was the first person willing to listen to what his silence had actually been saying. And sometimes, the strongest voice in a room begins with a single word, spoken softly enough to finally reach a broken heart. Asterisk, if this story moved you, tell us in the comments. Which moment hit you hardest? The word that broke the silence, or the moment he finally asked her to stay? Asterisk.